Smoke blotted out the sun above burning palaces. On the horizon, an armada of strange, high-prowed ships approached the coast. This was not a single battle, but the collapse of an entire age. At the center of this ancient cataclysm lies history's greatest maritime mystery, a question that has haunted scholars for centuries. Who were the Sea Peoples? These enigmatic marauders swept across the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, shattering empires and erasing cities from the map. Their sudden arrival helped trigger the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse, a dark age that reset the course of human history. By the end of this journey, you will hold a complete picture of this ancient puzzle, piecing together 30 distinct mysteries that range from their unknown origins to their shocking genetic legacy. We will explore why mighty civilizations like the Hittites vanished almost overnight, and how a band of raiders could become the famous Philistines of the Bible. What does the fate of these lost seafarers tell us about the fragility of our own world? Their name itself is the first great deception. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation or a uniform army. They were a confederation, a chaotic alliance of different tribes, each with its own name and perhaps its own homeland, united by opportunity or desperation. Egyptian inscriptions, our primary source, list them as separate entities. There were the Peliset, who would later settle on the coast of Canaan and become the famous Philistines of biblical lore. There were the Sherdan, often shown with distinctive horned helmets, who may have given their name to the island of Sardinia. The Shekelesh are tantalizingly linked to Sicily, the Lucca to Lycia in Anatolia, and the Denyon to the Greek Danaoi, possibly early Mycenaeans. This list is a map of the ancient Mediterranean in chaos, pointing fingers in every direction. One theory suggests they were displaced populations, refugees from a crumbling world turning to piracy and conquest. Another paints them as professional mercenaries and raiders, their services no longer needed by failing empires. The truth is, no single origin story fits. They were a mosaic of mystery, a coalition of the rootless, and their very identity remains the foundational enigma. To call them simply the Sea Peoples is to give a name to a shadow. But if they were a coalition of refugees, what were they fleeing from? Their violent arrival was not the first domino to fall. It was the result of a chain reaction already in motion. This is the second great mystery, the trigger of the cataclysm. What force or combination of forces could be powerful enough to uproot entire populations and set them adrift as a migratory storm? Historians point to a perfect storm of disasters, a series of push factors that turned the Mediterranean world into a pressure cooker. The first and perhaps most devastating was climate change. Around this exact time, tree rings and ice cores reveal a prolonged, severe drought known as the 3.2 kiloyear event. This was not a single bad season. This was a climate shift lasting decades. Crops withered in the fields, rivers ran dry, and famine stalked the land. For agricultural empires like the Hittites, whose power depended on grain surpluses, this was an existential threat. A single clay tablet from the Hittite capital pleads for emergency grain shipments from Egypt, a desperate cry for help that underscores the scale of the crisis. Imagine the social unrest, the panic, as food stores dwindled and people began to abandon their homes in search of sustenance. This environmental collapse was compounded by the very ground shaking beneath their feet. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a tectonic fault line, and archaeological evidence shows a series of powerful earthquakes struck key cities around 1200 BC. The mighty palaces of the Mycenaean Greeks show signs of violent destruction and subsequent abandonment. In Anatolia, Hittite cities were damaged and never fully recovered. These were not just buildings that fell, they were the administrative and economic hearts of these civilizations. With granaries collapsed, trade routes disrupted, and central authority crippled, the social contract began to unravel. Then came the domino effect. As one kingdom weakened, its neighbors saw an opportunity or felt the ripple of its collapse. Overpopulation in some regions, perhaps spurred by groups moving ahead of the drought, would have increased competition for dwindling resources. A society on the brink does not need a foreign army to destroy it. Sometimes it simply unravels from within. Peasants, soldiers, and even nobles, their world literally crumbling around them, would have had little left to lose. They became the displaced, the desperate, looking toward the horizon and the sea. The sea peoples then may have begun not as conquerors, but as climate refugees and earthquake survivors, pushed from their homes by forces beyond their control, only to become the push that finally toppled empires. Yet the great drought and earthquakes did not create the legend of the sea peoples, a pharaoh did. The third mystery brings us to the banks of the Nile, to the first and most vivid snapshot we have of these invaders in action. It is the year 8 of the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1177 BC. The scene is the marshy, branching waterways of the Nile Delta. After decades of watching empires fall to the west and north, the storm has finally reached Egypt's doorstep. Ramesses knew his kingdom was the last prize standing, and he prepared a monumental defense. Our window into this event is not a fragile papyrus but stone. On the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, Ramesses commissioned a vast, detailed record of the battle, a cinematic epic carved for eternity. These reliefs are our primary source, and they are breathtaking. They show a chaotic naval engagement, Egyptian ships with rows of archers grappling with an enemy fleet of distinctive design. The Sea People's vessels are unlike anything else in Mediterranean art. They have high, vertical prows and sterns with a single mast and a square sail, but their most striking feature is the bird's head ornament on the bow. They appear built for the open sea, not for river combat. On land, the reliefs depict a simultaneous infantry battle. The enemy fighters are shown in clear detail, and this is where their diversity shines. Some wear horned helmets, likely the shirden. Others have feathered headdresses, possibly the peliset. They fight from distinctive ox-drawn carts carrying their women and children, a telling detail that suggests this was not a raid but a migration of entire communities. The inscriptions boast of a total victory. The enemy is trapped in the delta's waterways, their ships overturned, their men slaughtered or captured. Ramesses claims to have saved civilization from the chaos. But this is where we must pause and question. This account is a pharaoh's propaganda, a victory monument designed to cement his legacy as a savior god. How much can we trust it? The battle certainly happened. The scale of the defense suggests a very real and immense threat. Yet the narrative is one-sided. Were the Sea Peoples truly the mindless horde of destruction shown here, or were they desperate families fighting for a new home? Did Ramesses win a decisive victory, or did he merely repel one wave of a much larger crisis, later settling some of the survivors, like the peliset, within his own borders to neutralize them? The Medinet Habu reliefs are a gift and a puzzle. They give faces and names to the shadow, but they filter everything through the triumphant eyes of the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom, leaving us to decipher the truth behind the stone. These strange ships carved into the temple walls are a mystery all their own. The fourth enigma lies not with the warriors, but with their vessels, an armada of unknown design. The Medinet Habu reliefs show the Sea People's fleet with astonishing clarity. Their ships are unlike the familiar Egyptian riverboats or the sturdy trading vessels of Canaan. They are sleek and aggressive, built for a different purpose entirely. The most striking feature is the high, vertical prow and stern, each often carved into the head of a bird, perhaps a duck or a goose. This gave the ships a distinctive, almost mythical appearance, like creatures of the deep coming to shore. Even more telling, these warships are shown without masts or sails during the battle. They are powered solely by rows of oarsmen, a design choice with profound implications. This was a warship built for speed, maneuverability, and independence from the wind. A mastless vessel could launch raids regardless of weather conditions, slipping into shallow coastal inlets where larger sailing ships dared not go. It suggests a naval culture perfected for hit-and-run attacks, not for long-term trade or ceremonial travel. The high prow would have helped it cut through the choppy waves of the open Mediterranean, pointing to a people intimately familiar with blue water sailing, not just coastal hopping. Their entire mode of warfare was maritime blitzkrieg. They could appear without warning, strike a vulnerable port city, and vanish back over the horizon before any organized defense could be mounted. This technological edge explains how relatively small groups could wield such disproportionate power, terrorizing coastlines from Anatolia to the Nile Delta. So where did this advanced maritime technology originate? The design feels like a missing link in naval history. Some scholars see echoes of these ships in later vessels. The bird-headed prow might be a precursor to the aphlaston, the ornate stern ornament of classical Greek warships. The overall sleek, oar-driven design hints at the early galleys that would later dominate the Mediterranean. Could the Sea Peoples have been the original innovators, their shipbuilding knowledge spreading and evolving after their dispersal? Perhaps groups like the Sherdon, who may have settled Sardinia, brought these designs to the central Mediterranean, influencing local boat-building traditions for centuries. Their ships, therefore, are more than just weapons. They are cultural artifacts floating on the waves, silent clues to a lost world of nautical expertise that helped reshape the ancient world. What other secrets of the deep did these master sailors carry with them? The warriors on the temple walls are armed for a fight unlike any Egypt had seen before. Their gear, frozen in stone, forms the fifth great mystery. Look closely at the Medinet Habu reliefs, and you will see a collection of weapons and armor that has puzzled historians for generations. The most iconic are the helmets. Some warriors wear helmets topped with a single, curved horn protruding from each side, often with a central disc or knob. These are the Sherdon, their headgear as much a symbol as a piece of armor. Other fighters sport tall, feathered or reed headdresses, a style associated with the peliset. These are not the simple leather caps of common infantry. They are bold, ceremonial, and designed to be seen. They speak of identity, perhaps even rank on a chaotic battlefield. Their shields are large and round, sometimes with a distinctive central boss, held with a single hand grip. This left the other hand free to wield their most fearsome weapon, a long, straight sword designed not for slashing but for a deadly forward thrust. This is a soldier's kit built for close quarters, disciplined combat, a stark contrast to the chariot-based warfare of the great empires. But where did this equipment come from? The search for answers has led archaeologists across the Mediterranean. Similar horned helmets, though made of different materials, appear in depictions from the Aegean world. The long, thrusting sword, known as the Nor Type II, has a very clear origin. This revolutionary weapon was developed in Central Europe and spread south through the Balkans into Greece. By the time of the Sea Peoples' raids, it was being widely used by the Mycenaeans. Crucially, examples of these swords have been found as far east as Cyprus and Ugarit, cities that fell just before or during the invasions. The round shields find parallels in early Italian and Sardinian art. So what are we looking at? A standardized invasion force supplied from a single source, or a mosaic of warriors bringing their homeland's gear with them? The evidence strongly suggests the latter. The Sea Peoples' arsenal appears to be a catalogue of the late Bronze Age world in turmoil. A Sherdon fighter might wear a horned helmet inspired by Aegean imagery, carry a European-designed sword adopted by the Mycenaeans, and bear a shield style seen in the central Mediterranean. This was not a uniform issued from a central armory. It was the collected military technology of a collapsing system, wielded by those who had once served it or fought against it. This eclectic arsenal reveals their combat style. The long thrusting sword and large round shield are the tools of an infantryman who fights on foot in a tight formation. It is the equipment of a professional warrior, not a hapless refugee. The fact that they fought on land and sea with this same gear suggests highly adaptable, mobile troops capable of amphibious assaults. They were the special forces of the ancient world, leveraging the best weapons technology available from across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their gear tells a story of connections, of trade routes that once carried goods now carrying conflict. It suggests that among the displaced masses were hardened soldiers, mercenaries whose employers had vanished, turning their skills toward conquest. When they appeared on the horizon, they were not just a horde, they were a walking, fighting museum of a dying age, and they were using its finest weapons to bring about its final end. Their weapons tell us how they fought, but their words remain utterly silent. This is the sixth and perhaps most frustrating mystery, the linguistic riddle of the Sea Peoples. What language did they speak? We have no letters, no treaties, no poetry carved by their own hand. They are a historical whisper heard only through the voices of their enemies. This silence forces us to become detectives of the faintest clues, searching for echoes of their speech in the names they left behind. Consider the names of places. The island of Sardinia bears a striking resemblance to the name Sheridan. Could a group of these raiders have settled there, imprinting their tribal identity on the land itself? Similarly, Sicily may derive from the Shekelesh. These are tantalizing hints, but they are not proof. They are like finding a single piece of a shattered pot and trying to reconstruct the entire vessel. More personal clues come from the Bible. The Philistines, descendants of the Peliset, provide a few personal names. The most famous is Goliath, a name that does not sound Semitic like the languages of Canaan. Some linguists argue Goliath has roots in Anatolian languages, possibly Luwian, spoken in what is now Turkey. Another Philistine name, Achish, may have connections to Greek or Aegean tongues. This paints a picture of a ruling class speaking a language foreign to the local population, a linguistic layer atop the Canaanite substrate. The most compelling recent theory points directly to Anatolia. At the ancient site of Troy and other places in western Turkey, archaeologists have found inscriptions in a language called Luwian. It was a major tongue of the Hittite sphere. Intriguingly, some scholars propose that groups like the Teresh and the Laka, listed among the Sea Peoples, were Luwian speakers from the Anatolian coast. If this is true, then a significant portion of the invasion force may have been fleeing the collapsing Hittite Empire, bringing their language with them. Could the Sea Peoples have spoken an early Indo-European dialect, a cousin to Hittite and Luwian, that was simply lost in the chaos of their dispersal? Imagine the scene on their crowded ships, a cacophony of different tongues, commands shouted in Luwian, prayers uttered in a Mycenaean Greek dialect, war cries in something else entirely. Their language was not one voice but a chorus of desperation, and when their power faded, that chorus fell silent, absorbed into the languages of the lands they settled. We may never hear their words, but in the names of islands and the echoes of giants, we catch the ghost of their speech. The silence of their speech leads us to a specific, legendary shore. One of the most compelling theories places the origins of at least some Sea Peoples not in a vague homeland, but at the very gates of a fabled city. This is the seventh mystery, the Anatolian connection. Could these raiders have sprung from the ashes of Wilusa, the city we know as Troy? The idea is not pure fantasy. It is anchored in the crumbling records of the Hittite Empire, the great power that once dominated Anatolia. Hittite diplomatic tablets speak of a troublesome western neighbor called the Ahiyowa, a name that sounds remarkably like Aegean, the Homeric term for the Mycenaean Greeks. These texts describe the Ahiyowa meddling in Anatolian affairs, supporting rebellious local kings in a place called Wilusa. This is a stunning historical echo. It suggests the world of Homer's Iliad had a basis in real geopolitical strife, a long-distance rivalry between the Hittite sphere and the Mycenaean Greeks over a strategic city on the Dardanelles. But the Hittites also mention another, more ominous coalition. Decades before the Great Invasions, their records tell of an Asuwa confederacy, a league of states in western Anatolia that rose in rebellion. The Hittite king crushed this alliance and took thousands of prisoners. The name Asuwa is thought by many scholars to be the root of the word Asia, and the list of conquered places includes names startlingly similar to some Sea Peoples tribes. Could the defeated warriors of Asuwa, displaced and resentful, have become the seed of the later migratory groups? Now layer onto this the epic poem. Homer's tale of the Trojan War, compiled centuries later, may preserve a garbled, mythologized memory of this very period of conflict. The war was said to have lasted 10 years and ended with the city's utter destruction, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its royal line scattered. If a historical Trojan War or a series of wars occurred around 1200 BCE, it would have created exactly the kind of destabilized, displaced population that could turn to seaborne raiding. The victorious Mycenaean Greeks, returning home after a long campaign, would have found their own palaces weakened and their economies in disarray, perhaps making them vulnerable to joining the chaotic exodus themselves. The archaeological evidence adds a chilling, physical dimension to this theory. Excavations along the western coast of Anatolia, from Troy itself down to sites like Miletus, reveal a consistent pattern. There are clear destruction layers dating to the late 13th century BCE. Cities were burned, often violently, and many were abandoned or significantly reduced in size afterwards. This was not a single army's path, but a wave of collapse rolling across the region. The timeline fits perfectly. The chaos that toppled the Hittite heartland from the east could have begun with the disintegration of its western frontier. As local alliances broke down, Mycenaean influence waned and desperate populations took to ships. So were the Sea Peoples Trojans, not exclusively, but it is highly plausible that among the mix of tribes were refugees from the fallen cities of western Anatolia, warriors who had fought for or against Wilusa, men who knew the sea lanes and had nothing left to lose. They were not a single nation from Troy, but the human debris of a shattered frontier, carrying with them the echoes of a war that would be remembered as myth. The fall of Troy was not an isolated disaster, it was part of a chain reaction that consumed the victors as well. While Anatolia smoldered, a far greater power was imploding to the west. The eighth mystery asks a provocative question: could the mighty Mycenaean Greeks, the builders of the Lion Gate and the heroes of Homer's epics, have become the Sea Peoples themselves? The evidence for this theory is etched in both clay and catastrophe. Around 1200 BC, the glittering palace complexes of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were violently destroyed, their great halls burned and their centralized economies shattered. This was not a foreign invasion, but a collapse from within, a failure of the very system that had made them powerful. The Linear B tablets, their administrative records, stop abruptly. What happened to the warriors, the sailors, the craftsmen who once served the Wanax, the Mycenaean king? They did not simply vanish. Many scholars argue they took to the seas, not as lords but as desperate refugees, their skills now turned to piracy and migration. The Egyptian records provide a crucial clue, listing a group called the Denyen among the invaders. This name bears a startling resemblance to Danaoi, the term Homer himself uses for the Greeks who besieged Troy. It is a direct linguistic thread connecting the Mycenaean world to the chaos in the east. The archaeological trail strengthens this link. The weapons of the Sea Peoples, particularly the long, thrusting Gnaw Type II sword, were standard issue in the Mycenaean arsenal. More tellingly, the feathered or reed headdresses worn by the Peliset in Egyptian carvings find clear parallels in the artwork of the Mycenaean world. A famous fresco from the Palace of Pylos shows warriors wearing what appear to be similar plumed helmets. This is not a coincidence of fashion, it is a cultural signature. So we must reimagine the end of the Bronze Age not as a clear line between civilized Greeks and barbarian hordes, but as a terrifying blur. The very warriors who might have sung of Odysseus's cunning voyage home could, within a generation, have been leading raids on the coast of Egypt. Their transformation makes a tragic kind of sense. The collapse of the palace system meant no more royal patronage, no more organized trade for fine metals, no more secure life for a soldier. A man trained for war with knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation faced a stark choice: starve in a ruined homeland or use those skills to take what he needed from others. The epic journey home becomes a desperate search for any home at all. Were the sea peoples the ghosts of Agamemnon's army, adrift in a world their victories helped unravel? It is a haunting possibility that turns myth inside out, suggesting the heroes of one age can become the monsters of the next. The weapons and names scattered across the Mediterranean point like arrows toward a rugged island in the heart of the sea. Our ninth mystery leads us to Sardinia and to a civilization whose silent stones seem to speak the language of the invaders. The Egyptian name Sherdon echoes unmistakably in the name Sardinia, a clue too loud to ignore. But is this just a coincidence of sound, or does the island hold the physical evidence to prove the link? The answer lies in the legacy of the Nuragic people, a mysterious culture that flourished on Sardinia for centuries, reaching its peak just as the Bronze Age collapsed. Their signature structures are the Nuraghi, imposing stone towers that dot the Sardinian landscape by the thousands. These were not simple huts, but complex, often multi-layered fortresses and community centers, built with precise dry stone masonry that has stood for over 3,000 years. They speak of a sophisticated, organized society capable of monumental construction. Yet it is the smaller artifacts, the things they held in their hands, that create a direct bridge to the chaos in the east. The Nuragic people were master bronze workers, and they left behind a stunning collection of small bronze figurines. Among these are depictions of warriors, and they are arresting. These statuettes show men wearing helmets topped with two distinct curved horns. They carry large, round shields with a central boss. In some cases, they even wear a protective corselet of armor. The resemblance to the Sherdon warriors carved on the walls of Pharaoh Ramesses' temple is not just close, it is nearly exact. It is as if an Egyptian artist and a Sardinian sculptor were looking at the same fighter. This cannot be a random parallel. The evidence suggests a profound connection, but it presents us with a classic chicken or egg puzzle. Did the Sherdon originate from Sardinia, sailing east as mercenaries or raiders and leaving their cultural stamp on Egypt's records? Or were they a group from the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps from Anatolia or the Aegean, who fled the collapse and sailed west, eventually settling on the island and giving it their name? The timeline is crucial. The Nuragic civilization was not destroyed around 1200 BC, it transformed. There is no evidence of a violent invasion on Sardinia at that time. Instead, archaeology shows a period of increased contact and cultural exchange. This supports the idea that the Sherdon may have arrived not as conquerors, but as refugees or migrants, integrating into the existing Nuragic society. Their distinctive military gear and seafaring expertise would have been valuable assets, perhaps elevating them to a warrior elite. They brought their identity with them, and over generations, the name of their tribe became the name of their new home. Imagine a fleet of those bird-headed ships, weary from years of conflict, sighting the Sardinian coast. They see the stone towers of the Nuraghi rising from the hills, a land already fortified and inhabited. A negotiation, or perhaps a slow integration, begins. The horned helmet warriors, their services no longer needed by fallen empires, finally find a place to lay down their round shields. Their story, etched in both Egyptian stone and Sardinian bronze, becomes a testament to how the displaced can become the founders, leaving a mystery written not in words, but in the shape of a helmet and the name of an island. The trail of the Shekelesh leads us to another sun-drenched island, a land of volcanoes and deep history. The 10th mystery asks whether Sicily, the great triangular island at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, was a target for the sea peoples or their forgotten homeland. The connection is once again rooted in a name, Shekelesh and Cycle, the ancient term for Sicily. It is a phonetic match that demands investigation. To understand it, we must look at what was happening on Sicily long before the first strange ships appeared on the horizon. Archaeological excavations reveal a vibrant island with established trade networks stretching across the sea. Mycenaean Greek pottery, Cypriot copper, and goods from the Aegean have been found in Sicilian settlements dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BC. This was not a remote backwater, it was a connected player in the Bronze Age world, a place familiar with Eastern goods and presumably Eastern people. Then around 1200 BC, something changed. At several coastal sites, there is evidence of destruction and burning. More intriguingly, following this period of disruption, a new cultural horizon emerges, associated with a people known historically as the Sicels. These were the inhabitants the Greeks encountered when they began colonizing the island centuries later. The critical question is, did the Shekelesh arrive from the east as part of the invasions, bringing their name and influencing the local culture to create the Sicyl identity? Or were they originally from Sicily, and the Egyptian records captured the name of a group of islanders who had joined the Great Migration, perhaps as mercenaries or pirates drawn into the chaos? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. On one hand, if the Shekelesh were invaders who settled, we might expect to see a sharp, intrusive change in material culture, a new style of pottery or weapon suddenly appearing. This is not clearly the case. The transition appears more evolutionary than revolutionary. On the other hand, if they were native Sicilians who left, why would they launch a desperate 1,000-mile voyage to attack Egypt? A more compelling theory blends these ideas. Perhaps the Shekelesh were a confederation of people from eastern Sicily who had long-standing ties, even kinship, with cultures in the Aegean or Anatolia. As the collapse unfolded, these connections turned into lifelines. Fleeing groups from the crumbling east may have sailed to their Sicilian contacts, merging with them. This fortified hybrid group, now swollen in numbers and armed with a desperate purpose, could have then turned back eastward as part of the larger movement, or sent out war bands to raid the richer, failing empires. Their name, Shekelesh, would have traveled with them, reported by Egyptian scribes. Later, after the invasions faded, the cultural blend that remained on Sicily solidified into what we call the Sicyl culture. The linguistic echo endured and the island kept the name. So Sicily may not have been a mere destination, but a pivotal hub in the storm, a place where old networks met new desperation, creating a feedback loop of migration and conflict that echoed all the way to the gates of the Nile. But defeat on the battlefield did not mean extinction. For one group of sea peoples, the clash with Egypt became the unlikely foundation for a new and lasting identity. This is the 11th mystery, the transformation of the Peliset from feared raiders into the settled Philistines of the Bible. After the great battle in the Delta, Pharaoh Ramesses III made a strategic decision. Rather than executing all his captives or letting them disperse to cause more chaos, he resettled them. He planted them as garrison troops in the southern coastal plain of Canaan, a buffer zone between a weakened Egypt and the rising inland powers. These 5 fortified cities, known as the Philistine Pentapolis, would become legendary: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Here, the shadowy sea peoples finally step into the light of archaeology, and their story shifts from invasion to integration. Excavations at these sites reveal a cultural explosion unlike anything else in the region. In the decades following 1200 BC, a new material culture appears suddenly and distinctly. The most dramatic evidence is in the pottery. The local Canaanite styles, with their simple forms and plain surfaces, are abruptly joined by a completely foreign tradition. This new pottery is beautifully decorated with intricate geometric patterns, spirals, and stylized birds. The technical quality is high, fired to a distinctive red and black finish. To any archaeologist, this is instantly recognizable as Mycenaean Aeolic pottery, a direct descendant of the styles used in the palaces of Greece and the Aegean islands. It is not imported, however. Chemical analysis shows it was made from local Canaanite clay, meaning the potters themselves had moved, bringing their skills, their aesthetic, and their cultural memory with them. They were not just raiders, they were families, artisans, and cooks who wanted to eat and drink from the familiar shapes of home. Their dietary habits tell an equally vivid story. The bones left in their trash heaps reveal a strong preference for pork, a meat largely avoided by their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors. Pig husbandry requires different knowledge and land than sheep or goats, and this practice points to a sustained cultural preference that lasted for generations. Even their architecture changed. At sites like Ekron, archaeologists uncovered large, multi-roomed buildings with a central hearth, a layout common in the Aegean world but alien to Canaanite design. This was a people consciously recreating a lost world on a new shore. For centuries, this Philistine culture remained distinct, a powerful, sophisticated rival to the emerging kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Their story, preserved in the Bible as one of conflict with figures like Samson and David, is the story of the sea peoples made permanent. They prove that these invaders were not a mindless force of destruction, but complex societies capable of state-building, art, and resilience. The Peliset did not vanish. They built cities that would stand for centuries, their Aegean origins slowly blending with the Levant until only their name and their enemies' stories remembered where they came from. The vibrant pottery of the Philistines tells a story of a homeland remembered, but their cities reveal a more complex truth. Within a few generations of their settlement, something remarkable began to happen in Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gath. The sharp lines between invader and local started to blur, creating a unique cultural fusion that defines our 12th mystery. This was not a simple takeover, but a slow, fascinating negotiation of identity played out in everyday life. The most visible sign is in the very pots they used. Initially, their pottery was a direct copy of the Mycenaean styles they brought with them. The beautiful red and black geometric designs a clear statement of "we are different." Yet, as the decades passed, these forms began to change. The clay was still local, but the shapes started to adapt to new needs. Canaanite cooking pots designed for different foods and hearths began to influence Philistine kitchenware. The decorative motifs, once purely Aegean spirals and birds, started to incorporate local floral patterns and even Egyptian-inspired lotus designs. By the 11th century BC, archaeologists find a true hybrid, a Philistine Canaanite ceramic style that is neither fully one nor the other, but something new entirely. It was the material expression of a people putting down roots, borrowing from their neighbors while still holding onto a core sense of self. This fusion extended far beyond the potter's wheel. Their language likely absorbed Canaanite words, even as their personal names retained a foreign sound. Their diet, while still heavy in pork, began to include more local grains and fish. But perhaps the most intriguing blend occurred in the realm of the divine. The Philistines brought their gods with them across the sea, though we know few of their names. One tantalizing clue comes from their later art and the biblical taunts of their enemies. There are suggestions they worshipped a goddess possibly related to the Mycenaean Potnia Theron, the mistress of animals, a powerful figure often shown flanked by beasts. Over time, this deity may have merged with or been reinterpreted through the lens of local Canaanite goddesses like Asherah or Astarte. Their temples, excavated at sites like Tel Kassil, show a unique architectural plan that doesn't match typical Canaanite shrines, yet the artifacts found within include both Philistine-style items and local votive offerings. This spiritual blending suggests a deep, pragmatic adaptation. To thrive, they needed their gods to understand this new land, and perhaps they felt the local gods needed appeasing as well. The result was a resilient, distinct culture that lasted for centuries. They were never fully absorbed by their Canaanite or Israelite neighbors, but they were irrevocably changed by them. This cultural fusion proves the Sea Peoples were not a temporary plague, but a lasting historical force. They came as invaders, but they stayed as neighbors, their identity constantly evolving in the crucible of their new home, leaving behind a layered legacy where every shard of pottery whispers of two worlds becoming one. The Hittite Empire was a colossus of the Bronze Age, a sprawling kingdom of iron and chariots that rivaled Egypt itself. Yet by 1180 BC it was gone, vanishing from history so completely that its very existence became a myth. This is the 13th mystery, the silent demise of a superpower, and the question of whether the Sea Peoples were its executioners or merely its gravediggers. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was a formidable fortress city perched on the Anatolian plateau, its walls inscribed with the deeds of great kings. Its sudden abandonment is one of archaeology's most profound puzzles. Unlike the burned ruins of Ugarit, Hattusa shows no clear layer of catastrophic destruction by fire. There is evidence of burning in some areas, but not the city-wide conflagration you would expect from a conquering army storming the gates. Instead, the palace and temples were systematically stripped of valuables, and the city was peacefully, deliberately abandoned. The gates were left open. This suggests a terrifying scenario, not of a single violent attack, but of a slow, strangling collapse. The empire likely died from 1,000 cuts, and the Sea Peoples were the wielders of a crucial blade. Their role was not necessarily to sack the highland capital directly, but to sever its lifelines. The Hittite economy depended utterly on trade, especially the import of grain from fertile regions to the south and east, and on controlling the coastal ports of Cyprus and the Levant for vital copper and tin. As the Sea Peoples' armada raided and destabilized the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, they shattered this network. Key port cities that served as Hittite vassals like Ugarit were annihilated. The sea lanes became a no-man's land, cut off from food and strategic materials, plagued by the same severe drought that caused famine. The central authority in Hattusa simply withered. The outlying provinces would have revolted or gone silent. The royal administration, unable to feed its people or pay its army, lost all legitimacy. In this light, the Sea Peoples were the ultimate disruptors. They did not need to march hundreds of miles inland to attack the heartland. They simply burned the bridges that connected it to the world. By the time any wandering bands might have reached the abandoned capital, there was little left to plunder but empty halls. The empire was already a corpse, and the Sea Peoples, perhaps unintentionally, had been the poison that stopped its heart. Their greatest victory was not a conquest, but a blockade that changed the map of the world forever. The silence of Hattusa's abandonment is broken by a desperate cry from the coast. While the Hittite capital faded quietly, another city met its end with fire and a final, futile message. The 14th mystery is not about a slow collapse, but a sudden, violent erasure captured in a single, baked clay scream for help. The city was Ugarit, a fabulously wealthy port on the coast of modern-day Syria. It was the New York or Shanghai of its day, a bustling hub where Mesopotamian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Aegean merchants traded ivory, copper, purple dye, and wine. Its libraries held epic poetry, its palaces gleamed, and its ships connected empires. Then, around 1180 BC, it all ended in a single horrific event. In the ruins of the city's administrative center, archaeologists found a clay tablet that had been fired in the very flames that destroyed the building around it. It is a letter never sent from the last king of Ugarit, Amurapi, to the king of Elashia, ancient Cyprus. Its words are chillingly immediate. The king writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." He then asks a heartbreaking question. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite land, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. This is not history written by the victors, it is a raw, real-time snapshot of terror. The letter reveals a perfect storm of vulnerability. Ugarit's army and its fleet, its entire defense force, were deployed elsewhere, likely answering a desperate call from their collapsing Hittite overlords or dealing with other threats. The city was a hollow shell, rich and utterly undefended, and the enemy knew it. The Sea People's strategy of lightning naval strikes meant they could appear without warning, targeting the most vulnerable points. The archaeological layer tells the rest of the story. The city was not just sacked, it was systematically burned. The heat was so intense it vitrified mud brick and melted precious metals. After the fire, no one came back to rebuild. The harbor silted over, and the great trading capital was forgotten for over 3,000 years. This tablet is more than a record, it is a metaphor for the entire Bronze Age collapse. It shows an interconnected world where obligations to a distant ally left your own home defenseless. It shows the terrifying efficiency of an enemy that moved by sea, striking where traditional land-based powers were weakest. And it shows the finality of the disaster. Ugarit's plea was frozen in time, a last whisper before the dark, a stark reminder that even the greatest wealth is no shield against a storm of desperate men in swift, bird-headed ships. The desperate letter from Ugarit was addressed to the king of Elashia, a plea sent to the one ally who might still send help. But Elashia, the ancient name for Cyprus, was itself caught in the same deadly current. This 15th mystery examines the island's complex dual role as both a victim of the storm and possibly a launching point for it. Cyprus was no mere bystander. It was a wealthy, strategic prize, the primary source of copper for the entire Bronze Age world. Its fate would dictate who controlled the metal needed for weapons and tools, making it a central battleground in the collapse. Egyptian records are explicit, listing Elashia among the lands that were cut off in the Great Upheaval. But the story archaeology tells is not one of simple conquest. Excavations across Cyprus reveal a pattern of violent destruction at major coastal centers like Komi and Kishon around 1200 BC. These were not random raids, these were targeted strikes against the economic heart of the island. Yet, in the ashes of these cities, something new and familiar begins to appear. Almost immediately after the destruction layers, a new cultural element emerges, one we have seen before. Pottery in the distinctive Mycenaean Aeolic style, the same ceramic tradition carried by the Philistines to Canaan, suddenly becomes widespread on Cyprus. It is not imported, it is locally made, indicating the arrival of new people with Aegean potting skills. This is where the mystery deepens. Was Cyprus simply overrun by sea peoples who then settled there? Or was the island already a multicultural hub with long ties to the Greek mainland and Anatolia, a natural refuge for displaced groups from those very regions? Some of these refugees may have been warriors, and their arrival could have destabilized the island, triggering internal conflict or inviting further attacks. There is a provocative theory that Cyprus did not just receive these migrants, it became a strategic base of operations. From its central location, a regrouped and resupplied coalition could launch coordinated strikes along the Levantine coast, with Egypt as the ultimate goal. The island's copper mines would have provided the essential raw material to rearm, turning Cyprus into a floating armory for the invaders. Imagine the scene: war bands from Anatolia and the Aegean, their own homes in ruins, finding a relatively intact and resource-rich island. They could either integrate peacefully with the local population or seize control by force. The archaeological evidence suggests a bit of both, a period of turmoil followed by a profound cultural synthesis. The old Cypriot scripts disappear and new defensive architecture springs up. The island's identity was remade in the crisis. So was Cyprus a stepping stone, a battleground, or a participant? The answer is likely all three. It was a stepping stone for migrants moving east, a battleground where old powers clashed with new forces, and an active participant in the New World Order that emerged from the chaos, its culture forever fused with that of the Aegean refugees. In the dark age that followed, it would be this hybrid Cypriot society that kept the flame of certain technologies and traditions alive, proving that from the heart of the destruction, new and resilient identities could be forged. The glittering halls of the Mycenaean world fell into a silence that echoes still. The destruction of palaces like Pylos, Mycenae, and Turin's around 1200 BC is a landmark of the collapse, but it presents a haunting chicken or egg dilemma. Did the fall of these Greek kingdoms create the Sea Peoples, or were the Sea Peoples the final blow that shattered a civilization already teetering on the edge? The evidence points to a vicious cycle where cause and effect blur into a single catastrophe. At Pylos, the linear B tablets, baked hard in the fire that consumed the palace, record a state of high alert in its final days. They speak of coastal watchers being deployed, a desperate effort to guard against a threat from the sea. This suggests an external danger was imminent. Yet the tablets also reveal a society straining under its own weight, with a complex bureaucracy managing every sheep and every piece of bronze. This rigid, top-heavy system may have been incredibly fragile. A prolonged drought would have caused famine, eroding the king's authority. If the central palace could not feed its people or reward its warriors, why would they remain loyal? The theory of internal rebellion, of a peasantry or a disgruntled lower nobility rising up, is compelling. The so-called Dorian invasion, long cited by later Greeks as the cause, is now seen less as a single ethnic migration and more as a messy, protracted period of population movement and cultural change from the north, perhaps pushed by the same climate pressures affecting everyone. So, which came first? It is likely a combination. Systemic failures, environmental stress, and perhaps internal unrest weakened the Mycenaean palaces, making them vulnerable. This instability may have pushed some Mycenaean groups, the Denyon of the Egyptian records, to take to the seas as pirates or mercenaries, joining the growing coalition of the displaced. Their departure would have further weakened the homeland. Then, as these very sea peoples raided and disrupted trade routes across the Mediterranean, they choked off any chance of economic recovery for the remaining Mycenaean centers. They became both a symptom of the collapse and a catalyst that accelerated it. The palaces did not just fall, they were caught in a feedback loop of disaster, where their own crumbling created the marauders who ensured they would never rise again. Our clearest window into this ancient conflict is framed by a pharaoh's need for glory. The monumental inscriptions at Medinet Habu are not a neutral documentary, they are a masterpiece of royal propaganda. To understand the 17th mystery, we must read between the carved lines of stone and ask, how much of the Egyptian perspective is history and how much is political theater? Pharaoh Ramesses III presents himself as the solitary savior of civilization, standing firm against a unified, apocalyptic horde. He claims a total victory so decisive it saved Egypt from the fate that consumed the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. But a closer look reveals a more complex and perhaps less flattering story. The most telling clue is a glaring omission. Ramesses III was not the first pharaoh to fight the Sea Peoples. His grandfather, the great Ramesses II, battled the Sherdun decades earlier, even incorporating some as elite mercenaries into his own army. More significantly, Ramesses III's own father, Merneptah, fought a major coalition of Libyans and Sea Peoples, including the Ekwesh and Sherdun, in a huge land and sea battle around 1210 BC. Merneptah also claimed a great victory, commemorating it on his own victory stele. So why does Ramesses III's narrative at Medinet Habu present the crisis as a unique, first-time event that he alone resolved? The answer lies in the core duty of an Egyptian pharaoh. His sacred role was to uphold Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and stability, against the forces of Isfet or chaos. A foreign invasion was the ultimate manifestation of chaos, By portraying himself as the lone defender who crushed a never-before-seen threat, Ramesses was performing the ultimate act of kingship, proving his divine mandate. It was a political necessity, especially for a pharaoh who was not of the main royal line and who seized the throne. He needed to outshine his predecessors and cement his legacy. This motive invites us to question the scale and unity of the enemy he faced. Did he truly defeat a single, massive, coordinated invasion aimed at Egypt's annihilation? Or were his battles against a series of severe but disconnected raids by various groups, which he brilliantly packaged into a single, epic narrative of salvation? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The coordinated nature of the land and sea attack described does suggest a level of planning. The presence of ox carts with families indicates a migratory movement of substantial size. Yet the idea of a single, unified Sea Peoples nation is almost certainly an Egyptian simplification, a way to label a complex, multi-ethnic phenomenon as a single agent of chaos. By defeating this one great enemy, Ramesses restored Mat with a single stroke. So, while the battles were real and the threat was existential, the story told at Medinet Habu is filtered through the lens of ideology. We are not seeing the Sea Peoples as they were, we are seeing them as the pharaoh needed them to be, a monstrous but conquerable chaos against which his godhood shone brightest. This propaganda, however, does not make the record worthless. It simply means we must decipher it like a coded message, understanding that the fear in the inscriptions is genuine, even if the glory is amplified. The pharaoh needed a legend, and in doing so, he preserved the name and image of his enemies for eternity, forever freezing them in the role he assigned them, invaders from a restless sea. Ramesses III's victory inscriptions provide our only tactical blueprint of the Sea Peoples in action. The 18th mystery reconstructs their frighteningly effective strategy, a brutal symphony of coordinated movement. They did not fight as a simple raiding party, but executed a sophisticated combined arms operation that targeted an empire's weakest points. The Egyptian records describe a two-pronged assault. Out at sea, their distinctive bird-headed fleet advanced, threatening the coastline and any naval response. Simultaneously, a vast land army marched south along the Levantine shore. This was not a column of soldiers alone. Crucially, the army traveled with ox-drawn carts, and in those carts were not just supplies but women and children. This single detail changes everything. An army burdened with families cannot move with the lightning speed of a dedicated military force, nor can it easily retreat. It moves with the slow, deliberate pace of a people on the move, carrying all they have left. This was not a raid for plunder, it was a migration under arms, a desperate search for land and a new beginning, willing to smash through any obstacle in its path. The tactical implication is profound. The naval force could strike coastal cities, sowing panic and diverting defenders, while the land force, a moving city of thousands, could besiege inland strongholds or simply occupy territory, its non-combatants immediately settling any ground taken. They were not hitting and running, they were arriving to stay. Egypt's response to this unprecedented threat reveals just how formidable the strategy was. Pharaoh Ramesses understood he could not meet this mobile, amphibious enemy in a traditional field battle. Instead, he turned the geography of his own homeland into a weapon. He allowed the Sea Peoples fleet to enter the confined, marshy waterways of the Nile Delta. This was a trap. The Egyptian army, lined with archers, waited on the shores and on the riverbanks. The narrow channels neutralized the maneuverability of the enemy ships, turning them into crowded, sitting targets. Egyptian inscriptions describe a hail of arrows so thick it darkened the sky, with soldiers using grappling hooks to pull enemy vessels close and board them. The land army, presumably separated from its naval support and bogged down, was met and defeated in a separate engagement. The Battle of the Delta was a masterpiece of defensive planning, a victory born from understanding the enemy's strength and turning it into a fatal weakness. It shows the sea peoples were not mindless brutes, but commanders of a complex, dangerous strategy that required an equally brilliant plan to defeat. Their failure at the Delta was a tactical loss, but their very method of warfare, a migrating nation armed to the teeth, remains one of history's most chilling and effective military concepts. Those ox carts laden with families changed the entire story. The 19th mystery shifts our focus from the warriors on the front lines to the vulnerable civilians in their wake, a detail that transforms our understanding of the sea people's true nature. The Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu are explicit. They show not just soldiers, but women and children riding in heavy, wooden carts pulled by oxen, moving with the land army. This is not the baggage train of a professional army on campaign. It is the entire worldly possession of a community on the move. Imagine the scene: the dust, the slow, plodding pace of the oxen, the cries of children, the anxious glances of mothers scanning the horizon. This single archaeological clue shatters the image of the sea peoples as mere pirates or mercenary bands. Pirates do not travel with their families and slow-moving cattle. They strike fast and retreat to a hidden base. This was something far more profound and far more desperate, a migration of whole peoples. Their motive was not temporary plunder but permanent settlement. They were not raiding the coast, they were searching for a new coastline to call home. This reality reframes their violence. The warriors fighting at the Delta were not just attackers, they were protectors, a desperate vanguard clearing a path for their kin to survive. Every city they burned, every army they shattered, was a brutal step in a grim journey to find stability. Their ferocity was born from having everything to lose, for behind them was only the ruins of their old world, and ahead was the hope, however slim, of a new one. This social structure implies a complete, functioning society on the move. There would have been not only fighters, but farmers, herders, potters, and healers. The presence of women means the community was self-sustaining and intended to reproduce itself in a new land. The oxen themselves are a critical detail. They are walking food sources and agricultural engines, vital for plowing fields once a new home was secured. This paints a picture of displaced communities, perhaps entire villages or small kingdoms uprooted by famine, earthquake, or war, who made the collective decision to abandon their shattered homeland and take to the seas and roads as a united group. The warriors were likely their fathers, brothers, and sons, their loyalty absolute because they were defending their own flesh and blood. This migration model explains the sheer scale and persistence of the threat that toppled empires. A pirate raid can be repelled, but how do you stop a slow-moving tide of humanity that fights not for gold, but for the very ground your city stands on? They were not an invasion force, they were a human storm, and in their carts they carried the seeds of a new world, sown with the ashes of the old. The ox carts carried families toward a future they could not yet see, but one group's journey may have ended on a peninsula far to the west. The 20th mystery follows a faint trail from the Nile Delta to the hills of Italy, connecting a name from Egyptian inscriptions to one of the ancient Mediterranean's most enigmatic civilizations. The Egyptian records list a group called the Teresh among the confederation of sea peoples. Centuries later, Greek historians like Herodotus wrote of the Tyrrhenians, a name used for the people we know as the Etruscans, the sophisticated culture that dominated central Italy long before the rise of Rome. The phonetic similarity between Teresh and Tyrrhenian is striking, a whisper across the centuries that begs a controversial question. Did some sea people sail not just to Sardinia or Sicily, but all the way to the Italian mainland, seeding the origins of Etruscan society? Herodotus himself provides a tantalizing clue. He claimed the Etruscans originated not in Italy, but in Lydia, a region on the western coast of Anatolia. According to his account, a severe famine led the Lydian people to split, with one half, led by a prince named Tyrrhenus, setting sail to seek a new homeland. They eventually landed in Italy, where they became known as the Tyrrhenians. This ancient migration story, long dismissed as legend, gains new resonance when placed against the backdrop of the Bronze Age collapse. Lydia was part of the Hittite sphere and the wider Anatolian world that was crumbling under drought, earthquake, and warfare. The Teresh of the Egyptian records could very well be these same Lydian groups displaced and taking to the sea. The timeline is plausible, with the Sea People's raids occurring in the late 13th century BCE, and the distinct Etruscan culture emerging in Italy by the 9th or 8th century BC. This gap allows for generations of settlement and development. The archaeological evidence, however, is where the mystery deepens. There is no clear, sudden destruction layer in Italy corresponding to 1200 BC that screams Sea People's invasion. Instead, we see a more gradual cultural transformation. The early Iron Age Villanovan culture, often seen as a precursor to the Etruscans, shows elements that could be interpreted as intrusive, but the links are subtle. The connection may not be one of violent conquest, but of slow integration and profound cultural influence. Imagine a fleet of Anatolian refugees, the Teresh, arriving on the fertile shores of western Italy. They would not have found an empty land, but existing Italic communities. Their integration could have been a slow process, their advanced seafaring skills, metalworking techniques, and perhaps religious practices gradually elevating them to a ruling elite over centuries. Linguistically, the Etruscan language remains a profound puzzle, a non-Indo-European tongue isolated in a sea of Italic languages. This isolation supports the idea of an origin far away, a language carried from Anatolia and preserved by a distinct people. While direct proof is elusive, the theory compellingly stretches the long arm of the Sea People's impact from the burning ports of the Levant to the very heartland of the future Roman world. It suggests the ripples of the Bronze Age collapse did not just destroy, they also scattered seeds, some of which would grow into civilizations that shaped history for a millennium. Their journey was driven by more than just hunger or conquest. Beneath the clash of swords and the burning of cities lay a silent, systemic collapse that turned producers into predators. The 21st mystery asks whether the Sea Peoples were ultimately economic refugees, their violence a symptom of a globalized economy in freefall. To understand this, we must look past the barbarian horde cliché and see the intricate web of the late Bronze Age world. This was not a time of isolated kingdoms, it was history's first international system, a fragile network of empires and city-states bound by diplomacy and, most importantly, by trade. Copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan and Cornwall, luxury goods like ivory, glass, and purple dye, all flowed along established maritime and overland routes. Kings and merchants from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Greece depended on this system. It was the lifeblood of their wealth, their military power, and their prestige. Then the web began to tear. The droughts and earthquakes that caused famine also disrupted the agricultural surplus that funded long-distance trade. As palaces burned, the royal customers for luxury goods vanished. As ports like Ugarit were destroyed, the shipping lanes themselves became perilous. Suddenly, the entire economic rationale for thousands of people evaporated. Think of the specialized workers in this system, the merchant whose ship now had no safe port to call at. The mercenary soldier whose employer, a Hittite king or a Mycenaean lord, could no longer pay his wages in silver or bronze. The artisan who crafted fine pottery for export, only to find his market gone. The miner in Cyprus whose copper now had no buyers with the wealth to purchase it. What did these people do when their world of specialized, interdependent jobs ceased to exist? They had skills but no structure to use them in. This is where the economic motivation becomes terrifyingly clear. The Sea People's attacks were not random. They consistently targeted the last remaining nodes of wealth and stability in the collapsing network. They struck at the grain-rich Nile Delta. They sacked wealthy trading emporiums like Ugarit. They aimed for Egypt itself, the last great economy still standing. their actions resemble less a blind migration and more a targeted, if desperate, strategy of asset seizure. They were not necessarily trying to destroy civilization, they were trying to capture its functioning remnants for themselves. The warrior with the Nile Type II sword was not just a fighter, he was a professional whose trade was war, and he was taking his services to the only market left, the open market of plunder. The families in the ox carts were not just fleeing, they were seeking a new economic base, land to farm, and a stable port from which to rebuild some semblance of their old commercial lives. In this light, the sea peoples become a tragic paradox, both the destroyers and the products of the world they destroyed. Their raids were the final, violent adjustment of an economic system that had failed its people, a brutal lesson in what happens when globalization unravels and leaves millions of skilled, desperate people with no peaceful way to use their talents. The ground beneath these ancient cities holds the final, undeniable testament to the cataclysm. Scattered across the Mediterranean, from the Greek mainland to the deserts of Canaan, archaeologists have uncovered a chilling pattern, a layer of ash and burned rubble that dates with eerie consistency to the years around 1200 to 1150 BC. This is the 22nd mystery, the physical footprint of the storm, a line of blackened destruction that connects the fates of empires. At Troy, the layer known as Troy 7 shows a city violently sacked and burned. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital Hattusa was abandoned, but other Hittite provincial centers like Alalak were put to the torch. Down the coast, the great port of Ugarit lies under a thick stratum of ash so intense it baked clay tablets into permanence. Further south, Canaanite cities like Hazor, Lachish, and Megiddo show evidence of fierce fires and collapse. Even early Philistine Ashkelon bears a destruction layer from this period, suggesting the invaders themselves were not immune to the violence they helped unleash. This is the burn horizon, a scar across the archaeology of an entire age. To stand at one of these sites and sift through that dark soil is to touch the moment the world changed, to feel the heat of a fire that consumed not just buildings but an era. Yet this very evidence presents a profound challenge. How can we be sure the hand that lit these fires belonged to the sea peoples? An ash layer is a fact, but its cause is an interpretation. Archaeologists must become forensic detectives searching for clues within the destruction. Was the city burned in a single, concentrated inferno, suggesting a deliberate military sack? Or are the walls tumbled in a specific pattern, hinting at an earthquake's massive lateral force? At some sites, the evidence is mixed. A city may show signs of seismic damage, with walls cracked and foundations shifted, but also contain layers of ash from subsequent fires, which could have been set by invaders taking advantage of the chaos or by citizens looting in the aftermath. Internal revolt is another possibility. Could the burned palaces of Mycenae or Pylos be the work of a starving peasantry rising up against a corrupt elite rather than foreign raiders? The weapons left behind, or more often the lack of them, can be telling. An invasion often sees valuable weapons looted from the dead, while a revolt might leave a different pattern of loss. The most compelling cases for sea people's involvement are the coastal cities, especially those with a simultaneous naval threat. Ugarit's desperate letter, found in its burned palace, explicitly names enemy ships. The swift, total destruction of this wealthy port, with no evidence of rebuilding by its original culture, fits the model of a lightning raid by seaborne attackers who then moved on. Conversely, the slow, systematic abandonment of inland Hattusa lacks the clear burn layer of a violent conquest, pointing to a different kind of collapse. This archaeological puzzle forces us to accept a messy truth. The burn horizon is not a single signature from a single enemy. It is the cumulative result of the perfect storm, where earthquake damage, internal unrest, and foreign invasion compounded each other. The sea peoples may have been the spark that lit the final blaze in many places, but the fuel for that fire was already piled high by decades of drought, famine, and failing systems. Their legacy is written in ash and shattered pottery, a grim geography of ruin that marks not just their path but the end of the world they helped topple. The thick burn horizon across the eastern Mediterranean is not a uniform blanket of ash. Amid the widespread destruction, two glittering jewels on the coast of Canaan remained conspicuously intact. The 23rd mystery asks not what the sea peoples destroyed, but what they deliberately left standing. The great Phoenician port cities of Byblos and Sidon, in what is now Lebanon, show a remarkable continuity through the chaos of the late Bronze Age. While Ugarit to the north was erased and cities to the south like Ashkelon were sacked and resettled, these centers thrived. Their temples were not burned, their harbors bustled, and their cultural traditions flowed unbroken from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. This glaring exception forces us to reconsider the sea peoples as mindless destroyers. Their violence was not random, it was selective. So why were Byblos and Sidon spared when every other major trading hub in the region fell? The answer may lie in cold, pragmatic calculation. One compelling theory is simple: tribute. These cities were fabulously wealthy, masters of the lucrative cedar wood and purple dye trades. It is possible their rulers saw the storm coming and chose negotiation over annihilation. They may have paid a hefty ransom in silver, food, and ships to the passing armada, buying safety for their walls. This would not be charity, it would be a business transaction. The sea peoples, burdened with their migrating families, needed supplies more than they needed another smoldering ruin. A loaded treasury and full granaries handed over willingly were far more valuable than what could be looted from a burned city after a costly siege. Another possibility is that these cities were simply too tough a target. Byblos and Sidon were built on easily defensible promontories with strong fortifications. Perhaps they had learned from the fate of Ugarit and mustered their defenses in time, presenting a bristling wall of spears that gave the sea raiders pause. Attacking such a stronghold would waste precious warriors and time, resources better spent on softer targets, but the most intriguing theory suggests a deeper, more strategic alliance. The sea peoples were disruptors, but they were not necessarily anti-commerce. They needed functioning ports. By leaving Byblos and Sidon untouched, they could preserve the very trade networks they themselves might later wish to use or tax. These cities were the gas stations and trade hubs of the ancient world. Destroying them would have crippled Mediterranean commerce for a generation, leaving nothing for anyone to plunder or profit from. It is even possible that some Phoenician ships and sailors joined the coalition, their unparalleled nautical knowledge becoming a valuable asset to the invaders. The survival of these cities is a masterclass in realpolitik from the edge of the Dark Age. It reveals the sea peoples not as a force of nature, but as a complex political and military entity capable of restraint and deal-making. Their goal was not apocalyptic destruction for its own sake, but survival, wealth, and territory. Byblos and Sidon stand as silent witnesses to a forgotten negotiation, proving that even in the midst of collapse, some lights were kept burning because it served the interests of both the conquered and the conquerors. The fires finally burned out and a profound silence descended upon the eastern Mediterranean. This was the aftermath, a world stripped bare. The 24th mystery is not about what was destroyed, but about the haunting emptiness that followed, a centuries-long interlude we call the Greek Dark Ages and the Levantine Iron Age one. Imagine a landscape where the great palaces were not just ruins but forgotten. The intricate bureaucracy that tracked every jar of oil and every bronze ingot vanished. The art of writing itself, a skill reserved for elite scribes, was lost across vast regions. In Greece, linear B script disappeared entirely, and for over 400 years the people there left no written records at all. Long-distance trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, shriveled to a trickle. The once busy sea lanes grew quiet, haunted only by local fishermen and the occasional small-scale trader. Populations plummeted, with people retreating from vulnerable coasts to fortified hilltops, living in smaller, simpler communities. The grand architectural projects, the cyclopean walls and columned halls, were beyond the means or the vision of this new, simpler world. This was a reset on a civilizational scale, yet nature abhors a vacuum, and from this simplified landscape, new and resilient powers slowly emerged, sketching the map of the biblical world. Along the coast of Lebanon, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, having survived the storm, began their remarkable ascent. With their rivals gone, they mastered the seas, establishing trading networks that would eventually stretch to Spain and beyond, and gifting the world a revolutionary new tool, the phonetic alphabet. Inland, nomadic Aramean tribes settled down, founding kingdoms like Damascus and creating a language, Aramaic, that would become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. In the central highlands of Canaan, a new identity coalesced from scattered tribes, the Israelites, forging a kingdom whose stories would be compiled into the Hebrew Bible. And on the coast, the Philistines, those former sea peoples, solidified their five-city confederation, becoming the formidable adversaries of Saul and David. The world the sea peoples helped create was no longer one of monolithic empires, but of smaller, fiercely competitive nation-states. This brutal clearing of the stage was a transformative, if traumatic, birth. The old Bronze Age order, with its rigid hierarchies and fragile, interconnected economies, was gone. The Iron Age that dawned from its ashes was fundamentally different. Iron, a more common and democratizing metal than scarce bronze, slowly came into wider use. Power was more distributed, innovation was driven by necessity, and new forms of identity, based on language and shared religion rather than loyalty to a distant king, took root. The invasions acted as a forest fire, devastating in the moment, but allowing new and hardier species to grow in the scorched earth. The world of the Old Testament, with its prophets, judges, and regional wars, was born directly from this cataclysm. So, while the sea peoples left a legacy of ash and ruin, they also unintentionally authored the first page of a new volume of human history, one where the voices of many peoples, rather than the edicts of a few emperors, would begin to tell the story. The silence of the ruins has finally been broken, not by a recovered tablet, but by the very bones of the people who lived there. In the last decade, a revolutionary new tool has entered the detective's kit, ancient DNA analysis, and it has turned a centuries-old theory into a scientific fact. At the heart of this 25th mystery lies a quiet laboratory where geneticists extracted minute traces of DNA from skeletons buried in the Philistine city of Ashkelon. They compared the genetic code of people who lived in the city before the Great Upheaval during the Bronze Age with those who lived there immediately after in the early Iron Age, when the Philistine material culture first appears. The results were a stunning confirmation. The Bronze Age inhabitants of Ashkelon carried genetic profiles typical of the local Canaanite population, but the Iron Age individuals, the first generations of Philistines, showed a dramatic and unmistakable new signature. A significant portion of their ancestry came not from the Levant, but from southern Europe, specifically from a genetic source closely related to ancient populations of the Aegean, from what is now Greece and southwestern Anatolia. This genetic wave appears suddenly, like a tide mark in the sand, precisely in the 12th century BCE. Then, as the centuries passed and the Philistines became established, this distinct European genetic signal began to dilute. By the later Iron Age, the Philistine population's DNA looked much more like their Canaanite neighbors again, showing they intermarried and integrated with the local people over time. This genetic data is a game changer. It is no longer just a theory based on pottery styles and helmet designs. It is direct physical proof written in the human genome that a large-scale migration of people from the Aegean Anatolian world arrived on the coast of Canaan at the exact moment history records the coming of the Sea Peoples. This was not a small band of elite warriors imposing their rule. The genetic influx is substantial, indicating the movement of whole families, of women and children alongside the men, exactly as the ox carts on the Egyptian reliefs suggested. These were communities on the move, carrying their genetic legacy across the sea and planting it in a new land. The DNA from Ashkelon is a molecular witness, testifying to a truth that potsherds and inscriptions could only hint at. The shadowy sea peoples were real migrants, their journey etched not just in stone but in the very building blocks of life. The genetic proof from Ashkelon confirms a migration, but the deeper scars of that time were written in stories passed down for generations. The 26th mystery asks how the collective trauma of the invasions echoed through myth and legend, becoming the cultural memory of a shattered world. Long after the ashes cooled, people tried to make sense of the darkness that had fallen upon their ancestors, and in doing so, they preserved a shadow of the sea peoples. For the Greeks who emerged from their dark age, the collapse was remembered as the coming of the Dorians. Later Greek historians described this as an invasion of crude, warlike tribes from the north, who swept down and overthrew the glorious Mycenaean kingdoms. This legend likely simplifies a far messier reality of population movements, internal strife, and cultural change over centuries. But the core of the story, a powerful external force destroying a golden age, perfectly captures the psychological impact of the Bronze Age collapse. It was a way for the later Greeks to explain the ruins of mighty palaces that still dotted their landscape, assigning a name and a narrative to the incomprehensible disaster that had befallen their forebears. The Dorian myth is the Greek memory of being overrun, a folk explanation for the silence that fell between the age of heroes and their own time. A far more detailed and personal memory was preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Here, the sea peoples are not a vague legend, but a vivid, ongoing threat, the Philistines. Their portrayal is not as a faceless horde, but as a sophisticated, formidable rival civilization. The stories of Samson and Delilah, of the capture of the Ark of the Covenant, and of the young David facing the giant Goliath are not just moral tales, they are frontier stories from a turbulent age. They remember the Philistines as people of the coast with their own gods like Dagon, their own metalworking monopoly on iron, and their 5 powerful cities. Goliath's armor is described in precise detail: a bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor, greaves on his legs, and a heavy spear, the panoply of a professional warrior from a technologically advanced society. The biblical narrative captures the tension of a long, bitter struggle for land and identity between the inland Israelites and the coastal settlers of Aegean origin. These stories fossilize the geopolitical reality of the early Iron Age, transforming the Peliset from Egyptian records into archetypal enemies, a literary testament to centuries of conflict and coexistence that began with ships appearing on the horizon. Perhaps the most haunting literary echo comes from Egypt itself, from a story set decades after the great battles. The tale of Wenamun is a sobering administrative report dressed as an adventure. It dates to around 1100 BC, a century after Ramesses III. It follows an Egyptian priest, Wenamun, sent to Byblos to procure cedar wood for the god Ammon's ceremonial barge. His journey is a portrait of a world where Egyptian power is a ghost. He is robbed, insulted, and delayed at every turn. The Prince of Byblos, while showing some respect for Ammon, treats the Egyptian envoy with cold, bureaucratic disdain, haggling over payment and reminding him that he is no longer in an empire that commands obedience. Most chillingly, Wenamun's return journey is threatened by 11 ships of the Tjekka, a group listed among the sea peoples who now control part of the Levantine coast. This is not the grand invasion of the reliefs, but its aftermath, a new normal where former raiders have become local powers, and the once mighty Egypt must negotiate from a position of weakness. The tale reads like a postscript to the collapse, a literary snapshot of a decentralized, dangerous world where the old order is gone, and the agents of its destruction now set the terms of trade. Together, these myths and reports are more than stories. They are the lasting tremor of an ancient earthquake, the way civilizations remember the day the sea brought fire and nothing was ever the same again. The absence of a clear homeland has always been the void at the center of this mystery. This gap in the map has for centuries invited speculation, leading us into our 27th mystery, the search for a lost homeland, a sunken origin. When history offers no satisfying answer, the human mind fills the space with legend. One of the most persistent ideas connects the sea peoples to a cataclysm so immense it scarred the memory of the entire ancient world, the volcanic eruption of Thera, the island we call Santorini. This event, however, presents a chronological problem almost as deep as the caldera it left behind. Thera exploded in a super-colossal eruption around 1600 BCE, a full 400 years before the Sea People's raids began. That is a gap wider than the time between the fall of Rome and the voyages of Columbus. It is simply too distant to be a direct trigger. Yet, the theory persists because the scale of the disaster was so unimaginable. The eruption obliterated the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete with tsunamis and ash, and its climatic effects were felt across the globe. Could the story of this world-altering event have been passed down for centuries, a cultural trauma that morphed into the legend of a lost land from which displaced peoples later emerged? The tale of Atlantis, first recounted by Plato centuries later, is often loosely tied to Thera. While Atlantis is a philosophical allegory, its core image of an advanced island civilization vanishing beneath the waves in a single day and night speaks to a deep-seated fear of catastrophic loss. The sea peoples, arriving from the sea with advanced ships and weapons, might have been remembered by their terrified victims as the survivors of such a sunken world, a people with no home to return to and therefore nothing to lose. Another speculative thread looks not to a single volcanic event, but to the slow, relentless work of the sea itself. After the last ice age, global sea levels were still rising. What if the true homeland of some of these tribes was not a major island like Thera, but a fertile coastal plain or a network of low-lying islands in a place like the northern Adriatic or along the Anatolian shore? These areas, rich in resources and positioned on trade routes, could have supported a vibrant maritime culture. Over generations, as waters gradually rose or a series of severe storms struck, these lands could have been slowly inundated, their people forced to abandon them for good. This would not be a sudden Atlantis-style catastrophe, but a creeping disaster eroding the literal foundation of a society over decades. These displaced coastal communities, taking their boats and their skills with them, would have become permanent migrants, joining with other uprooted groups to form the coalition we call the Sea Peoples. While these ideas lie on the fringe of academic history, they are powerful because they address a fundamental human need in the face of mystery, the need for a cause proportionate to the effect. The sheer scale of the Bronze Age collapse, the utter erasure of mighty empires, seems to demand an origin story equally grand, a lost civilization or an act of God. These speculative theories remind us that the mystery of the Sea Peoples is not just an archaeological puzzle, it is also a mirror. It reflects our own longing for narrative, for a story where chaos has a singular, dramatic source, rather than the slow, complicated unraveling of a stressed world. The lost homeland may be more myth than history, but its enduring appeal reveals just how deeply the shadow of these ancient marauders still stretches across our imagination. Their story is not just an ancient conflict, but a warning etched across 3 continents. For the first time in recorded history, a single chain of events shattered civilizations from the Greek islands to the banks of the Euphrates River almost simultaneously. This is the 28th mystery, the scale of the collapse, and it forces us to ask a profound question. Were the Sea Peoples the world's first global event? Before them, disasters were local. An empire might fall to a rival, a city might be sacked, a drought might afflict a single region, but the late Bronze Age was different. It was a truly interconnected world, a delicate web of diplomacy, trade, and mutual dependence stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Copper from Cyprus was alloyed with tin from Afghanistan to make bronze in Egyptian workshops. Mycenaean olive oil was stored in Canaanite jars. Hittite kings wrote to pharaohs as brothers requesting emergency grain shipments. This was globalization version 1.0, a fragile and magnificent system. The Sea Peoples did not just attack individual countries, they attacked the system itself. Their raids severed the sea lanes that were the internet cables of the ancient world. When they destroyed Ugarit, they didn't just burn one city, they deleted a crucial data hub through which Hittite, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian communications flowed. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces meant the loss of a major trading partner for everyone else. The failure of the Hittite Empire removed a massive consumer market and a guarantor of northern stability. Each node that failed increased the strain on all the others, creating a domino effect of economic and social failure. This was not a series of unrelated local wars, it was a systemic failure of the first global network. Think of a modern financial crisis where the collapse of a major bank in one country triggers panic and recession across the world because the economies are so deeply linked. The late Bronze Age collapse was the ancient equivalent. The interconnectedness that had brought wealth and stability for centuries became the very channel through which crisis spread with terrifying speed. The drought, a natural disaster, became a global famine because trade could no longer redistribute food. The loss of tin sources caused a bronze crisis everywhere at once. This ancient parallel makes their story chillingly relevant. It shows us that globalization is not a modern invention, but an ancient condition, and with its gifts come profound vulnerabilities. Our world, with its just-in-time supply chains, digital networks, and complex international finance, is far more interconnected than the Bronze Age ever was. The story of the Sea Peoples is a case study in what happens when that interconnected system is shocked by multiple crises at once: climate change, resource scarcity, and mass migration. It reminds us that civilizations are not isolated fortresses, but interdependent organisms in a shared ecosystem. When the sea grows restless, it does not send its storms to one shore alone. The panic in a merchant's office in Ugarit 3,000 years ago echoes in the concerns of a modern strategist watching shipping lanes today, a timeless lesson in the fragility of a connected world. Despite all we have uncovered, the Sea Peoples retreat into the shadows the moment we try to see their faces clearly. The 29th mystery is defined not by what we know, but by the vast, silent gaps in our knowledge, the unanswered questions that keep this ancient puzzle alive. The most fundamental gap is their own voice. We do not know what they called themselves. Every name we have for them, from Peliset to Sheridan, is a label given by their enemies, an outsider's term. They are defined entirely by how others saw them, never by how they saw themselves. This silence extends to their language. We possess not a single inscription, not a scrap of poetry, not a ledger or a love letter written in their own tongue. Imagine everything we know about the Egyptians from their hieroglyphs, or the Hittites from their clay tablets, and then imagine that evidence simply erased. The Sea Peoples are a historical echo heard only through the walls of other people's houses. Without their own words, we can never truly understand their motives, their beliefs, or the stories they told around their campfires. Were they proud conquerors or terrified refugees? We only have the terrified accounts of those they attacked. We also lack a precise timeline. The broad strokes are clear, a wave of destruction around 1200 BC, but the exact sequence of events is a blurred mosaic. Did the raids on Anatolia trigger the migration that hit the Levant, which then gathered force to strike Egypt, or were these simultaneous, cascading crises? We cannot pin down the chain of causation with certainty. The burn layers across the Mediterranean are roughly contemporary, but archaeology cannot tell us if the earthquake that damaged a city came 6 months before or 6 months after the raiders who burned it. This fuzziness means we cannot say for sure who struck the first blow in the collapse, or whether it was a single, coordinated campaign or a chaotic series of opportunistic attacks that history has lumped together. And then there is the ultimate question of their fate. For the Peliset we have an answer: they became the Philistines. For the Sherden we have a strong hint in Sardinia. But what of the others, the Lucca, the Shekelesh, the Teresh, the Denyon? After their names vanish from Egyptian records, they dissolve into the landscape of history. Did they settle in forgotten corners of the Mediterranean, their identities slowly blending into local populations until they were invisible? Did they meet violent ends in battles we have no record of? Or did they sail beyond the known world, their journeys lost to every chronicle? We simply do not know. Modern science has given us powerful new tools, from genetic analysis that confirms migration to climate studies that reveal ancient droughts. Yet, these tools illuminate the context, not the core. They show us the stage and the conditions, but the main actors still speak their lines in a language we cannot decipher. The Sea Peoples remain the definitive ghost story of archaeology, their presence undeniable, their impact world-altering, but their essence forever just out of reach, a reminder that some mysteries are carved not in stone, but in the empty spaces between the stones. Perhaps the most compelling reason we cannot let go of their story is that it feels unfinished. 3,200 years later, the mystery of the Sea Peoples remains a perfect, unsolved detective story, one where the crime scene spans an entire sea and the suspects have no names. We are drawn to it because it has all the elements of a timeless thriller: high stakes, the collapse of the known world, enigmatic villains who appear from nowhere, and consequences that echo for centuries. This is not a tidy chapter in a history book. It is a historical black hole, a period of profound chaos where the light of records goes out and our imagination rushes in to fill the void. We are fascinated by the darkness itself, by the idea that entire chapters of the human story can be ripped out, leaving only tantalizing fragments behind. Their saga forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our own place in time. The empires they toppled, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the kingdom of Ugarit, were not primitive societies. They were sophisticated, globalized, and powerful, convinced of their own permanence. Their swift and utter demise is a stark reminder that no civilization, no matter how grand or technologically advanced, is immune to collapse. The Sea Peoples are the personification of that vulnerability, a storm that rose from the sea to prove that even the mightiest walls can crumble. But this story is not merely one of destruction. At its heart, it is a deeply human narrative about movement and survival. It speaks to the timeless themes of mass migration, of people forced from their homes by disaster, real or man-made, undertaking desperate journeys in search of safety. It is about the violent conflict that erupts when the desperate meet the entrenched, and the painful, gradual resilience that follows as cultures fracture, blend, and eventually give birth to something new. We see our own world reflected in theirs, in the faces of climate refugees, in the disruptions of global networks, in the fear of the outsider and the struggle to adapt. Their mystery endures because it is ultimately our mystery too. It asks the same questions we ask today. What happens when the system fails? How do societies rebuild from the ashes? And what do we become when we are unmoored from everything we once knew? The Sea Peoples sailed off the edge of the historical map, but they left us with a mirror, and in its dark, ancient glass, we see the flickering shadows of our own fragile world. 30 distinct mysteries have led us from the burning coastlines of a collapsing world to the quiet laboratories of modern science. We began with a shadow on the horizon and a name given by their enemies, and we followed their trail through ash layers and genetic codes, through propaganda carved in stone and whispers preserved in myth. The journey reveals a truth far more compelling than the simple tale of barbarian hordes. The sea peoples were not mindless destroyers. They were complex actors caught in a perfect storm of disaster, a convergence of climate change, seismic upheaval, and systemic economic failure that turned an interconnected world into a tinderbox. They were both a symptom of the collapse and its final, violent accelerant. Refugees and warriors, pirates and pioneers, they were a mosaic of humanity on the move, carrying their families, their skills, and their desperation in ox carts and bird-headed ships. Their invasions did not just end the Bronze Age, they cleared the stage with terrifying efficiency. In the silence that followed their passing, the old empires of chariots and palaces were gone. But from that scorched earth, a new and more resilient world slowly took shape. The smaller, fiercely competitive kingdoms of the Iron Age emerged, the world of the Hebrew Bible, of the Phoenician traders, and the early Greek city-states. The Sea Peoples, in their brutal, unintended way, helped author the next volume of human history. Their legacy is not one of pure destruction, but of terrifying transformation. Today, the ghosts of these seafaring warriors still whisper to us. They whisper from the soot-stained ruins of Ugarit, from the silent Nuraghi of Sardinia, from the Philistine pottery shards in Ashkelon, and from the triumphant stone faces at Medinet Habu. They are a reminder that history is written not just by the victors, but by the gaps in the record, by the mysteries that refuse to be solved. They challenge us to look past the label of invader, to see the human story of desperation and survival behind the legend. So, what do you think? Were they the ultimate climate refugees or ambitious empire wreckers? Does the answer lie in a sunken homeland or in the scattered DNA of the Mediterranean? The case remains open. Share your own theories in the comments below, and if you crave more journeys into the heart of history's greatest enigmas, be sure to subscribe. The past is never truly silent, and the next mystery is always waiting.